Bakhmut nearly fully encircled by Russian forces, says reports. Russia's almost Russia almost has the entirety of Bakhmut in its grips as the Ukrainian forces are pushed back and Moscow shells the routes of the city. The last routes of Bakhmut were hit by Russia on Friday as Moscow seeks to complete its encirclement of the city that's been at the center of fierce battles for months now, putting Russia before a new major victory. The city, according to the head of Russian Wagner private military company Yevgeny Prigozhin, is almost completely surrounded with only one route still open for Kiev's forces. The UK Ministry of Defense stated earlier on Saturday that the routes to besiege Bakhmut made the possibility of resupplying the Ukrainian armed forces increasingly limited. The Ukrainian defense of the Donbas town of Bakhmut is under increasingly severe pressure with intense fighting taking place in and around the city. The MOD highlighted that within the last 36 hours, 2 key bridges in Bakhmut have been destroyed, including a vital bridge connecting the city to the last main supply route from Bakhmut to the city of Chasiv Yar. However, the Russian forces have also made additional gains and have advanced in the northern suburbs of the city, which is now a Ukrainian-held salient vulnerable to Russian attacks on 3 sides. Reuters news agency reported that there was heavy shelling from the Russian side aimed at blocking the Ukrainians from leaving and entering the city, thus preventing them from both withdrawing and receiving backup. Reportedly, ahead of the Russian shelling, Ukrainian soldiers were working on preparing the damaged roads, with troops heading toward the front line to bolster Kiev's position, as other troops were digging new trenches for defensive positions in the west. The Russian RIA Novosti news agency released footage showing Wagner fighters passing by a damaged facility, and one fighter heard saying Kiev's forces were destroying infrastructures and settlements near the city in order to prevent Russian encirclement. An advisor to the head of the Donetsk Republic, Igor Kimkovsky, said in late February that soldiers for the Ukrainian armed forces blew up a dam near Bakhmut, also known as Artymovsk, in a bid to slow down the Russian offensive and force civilians to leave the besieged city. The dam was blown up and the resulting torrent of water flowed toward Artymovsk. They're likely trying to halt our offensive. Maybe they want to try and cut off our assault units from the rear to slow down munition supply, Kimkovsky told Russian news agency Sputnik. According to the advisor, the move could also mean that Ukrainians were preparing to abandon the city to the Russian forces and were getting desperate. They told civilians to evacuate. Their goal is to make living conditions unbearable. They don't care about the people. They only care about destroying the city so that it'd be economically unfeasible for us to rebuild, Denis Pushilin's advisor added. Bakhmut's a slaughterhouse on both sides, said the commander of the Ukrainian army unit at Bakhmut, Denis Yaslovsky, during an interview with Espresso TV, adding that some units have been ordered to rotate to more secured positions. This comes after a U.S. mercenary fighting on the front lines against the Russian armed forces said the Bakhmut front lines were highly gruesome, comparing it to a meat grinder as Russia pushes against Kiev forces in the city for which battles have been taking place for months. Units of the private military company Wagner have practically surrounded Bakhmut, Prigozhin said. Only one route's left, the pincers are closing. The Wagner chief called on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during a video to order a retreat from Bakhmut, also known as Artymovsk, in a bid to save his soldiers' lives. The video then showed 3 captured soldiers asking to be allowed to go back home. A U.S. mercenary fighting on the front lines against the Russian armed forces said late in February the Bakhmut front lines were highly gruesome, comparing the front line to that meat grinder. Former U.S. Marine Troy Offenbacher underlined to ABC News that the life expectancy of Ukrainian soldiers on the city's front lines was only about 4 hours, with a major offensive still expected from Russia. Offenbacher underlined that he was not sure how long Kiev's forces would be able to hold the city, adding that the expected offensive had already kicked off and that attacks from Russians have been non-stop in Bakhmut, with artillery raining down upon it all day and night. The commander of a Ukrainian drone unit in Bakhmut, Robert Brovdy, came out and said his unit had been ordered to withdraw immediately, saying he'd been fighting there for nearly 4 months. Documents obtained by Politico show that the EU's been supplying Ukraine with arms through an off-budget intergovernment cash pot called the European Peace Facility, which aims to repay countries that sent arms to Ukraine. It has so far paid Ukraine $3.6 billion in military aid, with member states deciding to increase its funding by $2 billion in 2023. The document suggests that $1 billion should be focused euros should be focused on ammunition, notably 15 millimeters, as soon as the €2 billion top-up of the European Peace Facility is operationalized, according to an EU official. This means that half of the year's top-up should be for ammunition, mainly shells. The document also anticipated the increase in European industrial production, which is straining to produce ammunition at the rate demanded by the war. And that's from Al Mayadeen. And from globalnews.ca, pressure from Russian forces mounted Saturday on Ukrainians hunkered down in Bakhmut as residents attempted to flee with help from troops who Western analysts say may be preparing to withdraw from the key eastern stronghold. A woman was killed and 2 men were badly wounded by shelling while trying to cross a makeshift bridge out on the city of Donetsk, according to Ukrainian troops who were assisting them. A Ukrainian army representative, who asked not to be named for operational reasons, told the Associated Press that it was now too dangerous for civilians to leave Bakhmut by vehicle and that people had to flee on foot instead. Bakhmut has for months been a prime target of Moscow's grinding eastern offensive in the war, with Russian troops, including forces from the Wagner Group, inching even closer. An AP team near Bakhmut on Saturday saw a pontoon bridge set up by Ukrainian soldiers to help the few remaining residents reach the nearby village of Kromov. Later, they saw at least 5 houses on fire as results of attacks in Kromov. Ukrainian units, over the past 36 hours, destroyed 2 key bridges just outside Bakhmut, including one linking it to the nearby town of Chasiv Yar, along the last remaining Ukrainian resupply route, according to UK military intelligence officials and other Western analysts. The UK Defence Ministry said in the latest of its regular Twitter updates that the destruction of the bridges came as Russian fighters made further inroads into Bakhmut's northern suburbs. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank, assessed late on Friday that Kiev's actions may point to a looming pullout from parts of the city. It said Ukrainian troops may conduct a limited and controlled withdrawal from particularly difficult sections of eastern Bakhmut, while seeking to inhibit Russian movement there and limit exit routes to the west. Capturing Bakhmut would not only give Russian fighters a rare battlefield gain after months of setbacks, but it might rupture Ukraine's supply lines and allow the Kremlin's forces to press toward other Ukrainian strongholds in the Donetsk region. Civilians spoke about daily struggles as the fighting raged on nearly nonstop, reducing much of Bakhmut to rubble. Husband and wife Hennady Mizapa and Natalia Ishkova, who chose to remain in the city, say they lack food and basic utilities. Humanitarian aid is given to us only once a month. There's no electricity, no water, Ishkova told AP on Saturday. I pray to Allah that all who remain here will survive, she said. At the United Nations on Friday, Deputy Spokesman Farhan Haq said UN humanitarian staff reported intensive hostilities near Bakhmut, and the few humanitarian partners on the ground were focusing on evacuating the most vulnerable. Also, Saturday, Russia's defense chief traveled to eastern Ukraine to inspect troops and award them with state decorations, the defense ministry said. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited a command post where he was briefed by regional commander Rustam Muradov, according to a video published by the ministry. It didn't disclose the command post's selection. Elsewhere, Ukraine's emergency services reported in the morning that the death toll from a Russian missile strike that hit a 5-story apartment building in southern Ukraine on Thursday rose to 11. Emergency services said in an online statement that rescuers pulled 3 more bodies on the wreckage overnight, some 36 hours after a Russian missile tore through 4 floors of the building in the riverside city of Zaporozhye. A child among those reported killed, and rescue efforts ongoing. Russian shelling on Saturday also killed 2 residents of frontline communities in the surrounding Zaporozhye. region that the local military administration reported. A 57-year-old woman and a 68-year-old man also died in Nikopol, a town farther west near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, as Russian forces fired artillery shells and rockets at Ukrainian-held territory across the Dnieper River. Regional government Seri Lysak reported. In the western city of Lviv, hundreds of kilometers from the front lines, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met Saturday with the head of the European Union Parliament. Hours earlier, Zelensky held talks with U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland and top European legal officials on how to hold Russia accountable for its actions in the Ukraine. In a joint press briefing with Zelensky, European Parliament President Robert Metsola said that all those responsible for suspected Russian war crimes in Ukraine, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, must be brought to justice before a durable peace is achieved. Metsola voiced support for the EU's announcement Thursday that an international center for the prosecution of the crime of aggression, that act of invading another country, would be set up in The Hague. She also called for Ukraine to start negotiations on joining the 27-nation bloc as early as this year, and urged Western nations to keep arming Kiev as it battles Russian forces in the east and south. The EU agreed in June to put Ukraine on a path toward membership, setting in motion process that could take years or even decades. However, Moscow's invasion and Ukraine's request for fast-track consideration have lent urgency to the negotiations. Ukraine's future is in the European Union. We will walk all the way with you, Metsola said on Twitter late Friday. Ukraine latest. Bakhmut residents flee as city takes on heavy fire. This is from AsiaNikkei.com. The war that began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has reached a grim one-year milestone, with mounting military and civilian deaths. As Russia steps up attacks around Bakhmut, Western nations have raised their military support for Ukraine to the highest level yet, with commitments to send main battle tanks. Here are the latest developments. 1 a.m. Kiev's troops, civilians flee Bakhmut in a move some Western analysts see as preparations for a possible Ukrainian withdrawal from the eastern city under heavy assault from Russian forces. A woman's killed, 2 men are badly wounded by shelling while trying to cross a makeshift bridge out of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian military says. A Ukrainian army representative tells the Associated Press that it was now too dangerous for civilians to leave the city in Donetsk province by vehicle, and that people had to flee on foot yesterday. And Saturday, March 4th, North Korea, which has been a staunch supporter of Moscow since its launch of its invasion of Ukraine, calls for an international investigation into blasts that damaged Russia's undersea Nordstream gas pipelines last year. Moscow says without providing evidence the West was behind the blast that damaged the pipelines in September, and has called for an international investigation. Western officials have denied those accusations. In a Northern Korean state news agency article, international affairs critic An Chol-hyuk calls for an impartial investigation, saying the world needs to be aware of the vicious coerciveness, war, and conspiracy maneuvers of the United States. Russian artillery pounds the latest routes of Bakhmut, aiming to completely encircle the besieged Ukrainian city and score Moscow's first major victory in a half a year in the bloodiest fighting of the war. The head of Russia's Wagner private army said the city blasted to ruins during a month. The more than 7-month onslaught was almost completely surrounded, with only one road still open for Ukraine's troops. Reuters observed intense Russian shelling of routes leading west out of Bakhmut, and apparent attempt to block Ukrainian forces' access in and out of the city. A bridge in the adjacent town of Kromo was damaged by Russian tank shelling. The U.S. announces a new military aid package for Ukraine at 3:12 a.m. yesterday, worth up to $400 million, that for the first time will include mobile bridges to move tanks and armored vehicles. The bridges, known as armored vehicle launch bridges, will accompany demolition munitions and equipment used for clearing obstacles, the U.S. Department of Defense says, in what analysts see as support for offensive operations. Assault bridging allows armored vehicles to cross narrow rivers and ditches that would otherwise cause a whole force to slow down, Jack Watling, a senior research fellow for land warfare at the London-based Royal United Services Institute, tells Reuters. Importantly, assault bridges are only critical for offensive operations, showing that the U.S. is preparing Ukraine to continue retaking its territory. The new aid will provide much-needed 155 millimeter and other artillery rounds, which Ukraine has sought, as well as additional ammunition for highly mobile artillery rocket systems. And from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, this is referral. Situation critical for Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut as civilians reportedly flee on foot. Residents were reportedly fleeing on foot from the devastated eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut as Russian forces shelled the area and the last remaining escape routes, with Kiev saying the situation was critical for Ukrainian defenders even as they continue to repel multiple attacks in the region. Ukrainian troops told AP on March 4th that a woman was killed and 2 men were severely injured by Russian shelling as they were attempting to cross a makeshift bridge out of Bakhmut, a day after the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group said the city was nearly surrounded. AP quoted an unnamed Ukrainian army representative as saying it was now too dangerous for civilians to depart Bakhmut by vehicle because of Russian shelling, and the most were forced to flee on foot. Western military experts said the situation in Bakhmut remains critical and the Ukrainian defenders are coming under increasingly severe pressure in and around the city, which had a pre-war population of about 70,000. In the eastern region of Donetsk, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said in its daily bulletin that the Ukrainian military had repelled more than 150 attacks by Russian troops over the past day in the areas of Bakhmut, Lyman, Avdiivka, and Shakhtarsk. The enemy is ceaselessly attempting to encircle Bakhmut, the General Staff said, adding that numerous attacks aimed at surrounding Bakhmut were repelled by Ukrainian fighters in the adjacent areas of Vasyukivka, Dubovo, and Vasilivka and Ivanivsk. Battlefield reports from either side could not immediately be verified. Ukrainian officials have suggested that their troops might have to pull out of Bakhmut entirely once the defense of the city becomes too costly and withdraw to new positions in the west and the northwest, where Ukrainians are reported to have far stronger defensive positions. Despite the situation described by a Ukrainian commander as critical, Kiev's defenders were reportedly digging in at defensive sites and were not ready to give up the town. All units involved in the defense of Bakhmut clearly perform their tasks. Our soldiers are constantly working in extremely harsh conditions and doing everything to ensure that the number of enemy's forces is reduced every day, General Viktor Korenko, the commander of the Special Operation Forces, wrote on Facebook. And from TurkiaNewspaper.com, according to the statement of the Russian Wagner mercenary forces, Bakhmut is practically besieged. Russia announced that Wagner mercenary forces have surrounded the Bakhmut region of Ukraine. The founder of the mercenary forces called on the Ukrainian President Zelensky to evacuate Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of Russia's Wagner mercenary force, said in a video published on Friday, March 3rd, that the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut was practically surrounded by his forces and that Kiev's forces had only one road left out. Prigozhin's men have spearheaded the assault in eastern Ukraine for months. Moscow regards Bakhmut, which it calls by its Soviet-era name of Artymovsk, as a useful stepping stone to seize bigger cities like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Prigozhin, wearing a military uniform in the video, called on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to withdraw his forces from the small city. Bakhmut was besieged. Units of the private military company Wagner have practically surrounded Bakhmut. Only one road is left open to Ukrainian forces. The pinchers are getting tighter, said Prigozhin. The location of the video was verified by buildings, walls, the railway lines, rivers, which match satellite imagery. It was shot approximately 7 kilometers north of the center of Bakhmut in the settlement of Paraskovivka. The date it was filmed could not be independently verified. Prigozhin announced the capture of Paraskovivka on February 17th. Prigozhin said his forces were increasingly fighting against old men and children rather than the professional Ukrainian army. Prigozhin on Thursday released another video showing his fighters inside Bakhmut. Reuters geolocated the footage to the east of Bakhmut, around 1.2 miles from the center of the city.
is obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your argument strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
The whole notion of logic.
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I'm chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you.